Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and I'm pretty excited about our guest tonight, Greg Eghigian. He was on back in 2018, and I remember it was a excellent show. And he's on. He has a new book, and I'm going to bring that up here in just a second here. And it's an interesting concept, if you ask me. And the name of the book is After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon. And it's a lot of it is about the people's reaction. I think he makes a statement something like, it's not the UFOs that make history, it's the people that make the history about the UFOs, which I think is, absolutely correct as far as that goes. I do want to make a couple announcements. First of all, this coming weekend at the Pine Bush UFO Paranormal Museum. Randall Nickerson, I met with Randall yesterday at his home in Massachusetts, hung out with him for a few hours, had a really good talk with him. I do have to say, he's going to be more public about this, but he has actually been really treated wrong, and along with other people too. I know I had Ron James on recently. He spoke briefly about it, but we're talking James Fox and many other people. I don't know if there's going to be some type of class action, but there is a film company that has really done them wrong. And I'm hoping Randall said he's going to start talking publicly about it. I will certainly give him a platform to talk to, because when someone's done wrong, I think it should be turned around and should be treated the way that they were supposed to be treated contractually. Anyway, so he's going to be speaking. He's going to be showing the film at the museum and speaking afterwards. So you can get over there if you're anywhere near the Pine Bush area. It would be great to hang out. He's very approachable, great guy, Randall Nickerson. So check that out coming up. That is this August 3rd. Geez, is that a Saturday, or I think that's a Saturday evening. I don't have my calendar right up here in front of me, but that's at the museum, and check that out. And that is Saturday, yes, at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. So our guest this week again is Greg Eghigian. He wrote this book. Just to let you know, on Thursday night, I also have this gentleman, and his name is Robert Kvyat, and he is a filmmaker. He's done a lot of things on Fox television with UFOs and things like that. He'll be on talking about the Mandela effect. I'm kind of on the fence about how I feel about that. I understand how it works, but so that's 8 p.m. this coming Thursday right here on this channel. And thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure seeing you in chat and all that. Oh, I don't want to forget our great blog this week, because it has to do with Paul Bennewitz and what he filmed at in New Mexico back in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's called The UFOs Caught on Film by Paul Bennewitz. And there are some images. Now, Charles, our blogger, worked directly with Chris Lambright, who actually wrote a book on this whole situation. So there's some interesting images, and you'll see that all on the blog here at podcastufo.com. Come in and check it out. And thank you all who support the show. And those of you who cannot support, I do thank you for watching and listening. And it would be great if you can write reviews, whatever you can do to help the show. I would really appreciate it. And just to have you here at all is a real pleasure. And here is our guest. Hello, Greg. Welcome.
Hi.
So, Greg, you were on quite a while ago now, as it stands, and I remember it was a really great conversation. And you are a professor of history. You're at what is it, in Pennsylvania, right?
Right, Penn State University. You might have heard we have a football team.
I think I might have heard that. Yeah, yeah. So you've been there a while, right?
Yes, I have. I've been here since the early 2000s. So yeah, Penn State is. I'm pretty much at this point a Penn Stater. I think it's official now.
I hope so. You're tenured, I would imagine, by this
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
yeah.
Hey, so I got to ask you right off the bat: have you ever got any blowback for looking at this UFO topic?
You know, I will say, by and large, no. I mean, I think particularly early on, maybe when I was starting to get into this, I had some people who, an upturned brow or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think you know what it's like. Usually, when you bring this topic up, there's some people who are kind of sizing you up and
Oh, yes.
wondering what's your angle here. Why are you interested in this? I had a little of that.
Yeah.
But I will say, by and large, the reaction I've gotten in the world of academia has been overwhelmingly not only supportive but downright enthusiastic. I get
Wow.
lots of "Wow, that is cool," or
Yeah.
"Man, I wish I had thought about that," or
Yeah.
one graduate student who said to me, "I didn't know we could write about things like this," and I said, "Yes, you can."
Oh,
So
that's awesome.
I
Yeah.
think it's indicative of the kind of sea change and changes in ideas that are out there these days.
Yeah. I have to I mentioned this on a show a while back, a few weeks ago, and I'll just throw it out there again in case people missed it, but I think it's kind of funny. I was helping my cousin with basically a yard sale of her where she grew up. Her family had been there for the last 59 years. And so I was helping her price, what how to set it up and helped her through it basically. And at some point I said, I don't know if you know if this is any family, if the family knows this or not, but do you know that I do a show on UFOs? And she went, oh, like that. And I go, what? And I said, what? And so she goes, oh, like that. Like I'm the crazy man. And I went out, the crazy cousin. I went into the other room and I came back out and she's like texting someone away. I go, I know what you're doing. I know you're right. Crazy cousin Marty, as they called me, or whatever. I hope people don't start calling me that. But
Well,
anyway,
somebody's
uh,
got to somebody's got to fill in that role in the family, and
that's right.
obviously
Yeah.
it's you. So there you go.
Yeah. But her husband, who I always call my favorite cousin-in-law, I mean, he's such a cool guy, really great guy. So I said, well, you might as well, you're going to hear it from your wife. So I might as well tell you. And he goes, awesome. Oh my God. He's like the enthusiast. That's so great. He goes, he has a plumbing business. And he says, I got to have one of my workers. They had a UFO. I got to have them talk to you. And I said, great. And he goes, do you know of Betty and Barney Hill? And I said, yeah.
Yeah,
He said,
yeah.
well, Barney was my postman when I was growing up. And
Wow.
he hung out. I don't know how he ever delivered mail. He said he'd hang out for an hour or two sometimes and
Huh?
talk. He said he didn't talk that much about UFOs, but every once in a while he would bring it
Right.
up. So it wasn't his
Wow.
main thing he talked about.
Small world.
Yeah, yes, right in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So
Yeah,
that's right
yeah,
where they were from. Yeah.
yeah.
He's actually the he's actually the first person I have met, and I grew up in this area, in the Portsmouth
Uh-huh,
area, that actually knew Barney. I
uh-huh.
know many people that knew Betty, but only
Right.
one. He's really the only person I've ever talked to that knew Barney.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
it sounds like by everything I've ever read, of course, she was, of course, she lived a much longer life, but
yeah.
she was really a very sociable person. I mean,
Yeah.
she got out there, and some things I've read seem to indicate that Barney was a little more reserved, a little shyer than she was. She
Yeah.
seems like she was pretty outgoing.
She really was. Yes, I've talked to a lot of people that would say basically that. I was in a house and there was a picture on a wall, and I'm looking, and this was a house to look for antiques. Someone was selling antiques, and I was called in there as an appraiser, basically. And I'm looking
Mm.
at this picture, and I said, "Is that woman named Betty?" And they said, "Oh yeah, Betty Hill was a great friend." I mean, like,
Ah,
and
see,
that was in two towns over. Yes, she was very sociable.
very
Yeah.
neat.
Definitely. So, Greg, I know we've gotten way off topic,
Ah.
but your book, what was the impetus for you to write this book in particular?
Well, I probably a good decade ago, I was just on a lark. I started to look into um, this question I had in my mind that came up. It really was sort of inspired by talking to a friend of mine who was working on a fairly unrelated project, but about the occult after World War II. And I kind of had wondered whether there were, these flying saucer sighting and reports about them, in other countries. And particularly, I was working on Germany at the time. I thought, well, what if I were to go in and look at some of these digitized newspapers from the late 40s and early 50s? And, were they reporting about flying saucers? And sure enough, I go in there and bam, there they were. And I thought, well, that's wild. And then I just, this is what we nerdy historians do. We get excited about things like that. I start reading, I start taking notes, and pretty soon I realize I have an article. And then a friend of mine said, you ought to write a book about the history of UFOs. I said, oh, come on. There has to be so many professional historians who've done this already. I'm not going to just add one more voice. And then I looked up and I realized that there's a lot of books about historical aspects of it. But as far as I was ever able to determine, the only professor of history who ever wrote a book about the history of UFOs, right, was David Jacobs, right? The famous David Jacobs,
right.
who of course later on becomes a part of the story. And that
what
just
about
shocked
McDonald?
me.
I don't know what McDonald.
No, McDonald. Yeah, McDonald
what his study was. He was in history.
He never wrote a book, and he did atmospheric physics. People like Alan Hynek and Jacques Vallée, none of them were academic historians, right? So you didn't really have anybody do that. And I thought, my God, nobody's written a history of this thing since 1975. At least nobody from, like I say, a professional historical background like my own. And that's when I thought, well, I think it's time. And little did I know how deep those waters are, because a lot has happened since 1975. And there are a lot of threads and a lot of elements. And then the other thing, as I realized soon, given what I had just done about this German thing, I realized I couldn't talk about this without trying to incorporate the rest of the world. This couldn't just be about American sightings and American figures. It had to be about a lot of other people who made these UFOs make history, as I like to say. So that's how I got into it and started just becoming utterly, utterly fascinated by it.
And the statement you make, it's like the people are the ones that make the history of UFOs. But how much, I didn't get much of a chance to breeze through too much in your book, but you hear a lot of people will talk about, that it's all initiated from pop culture. And so I just want to say, ask this question: how much does pop culture play into what you've researched?
So I would say the way I see it, from what I could really glean from then the historical record, is UFOs as we know of them, as we think about them, as we talk about them, are really unimaginable without popular culture, popular media. That includes newspapers, magazines, radio, today podcasts, things like that. We would not be thinking and talking about them the same way without those influences. That said, I think there's every indication that UFO sightings from their very beginnings to, I think, this very day, to me, are what I would call a grassroots phenomenon. That is, they bubble up from below. They are not the result of, you can't explain them away by pop culture. You do not see evidence, I think, in a very simplistic way that somehow, there's been a movie about UFOs recently, and now you got all these sightings, and they're all reporting exactly what Steven Spielberg just showed us. You don't really see that. That's not the way it worked, and it hasn't worked that way. So I think there's this complicated thing going on where this phenomenon took place, and it kept taking place with, as you well know, flaps and waves along the way. There were periods when there were very little action going on. But what you have is then a bunch of people trying to make sense of it. You have lots of, at different points in time, you have high concentrations of media attention on it, like these days, right? And then those inform the way in which people start to speculate and think about things. But I think the impact on actual witness sightings and things like that is relatively minimal from what I can see. And so you have something going on that's, I think, very hard to tease out, right? Where one aspect starts and the other begins. But I think without question, the sightings themselves, those tend not to be something that are easily influenced by pop culture.
Well, I'm kind of relieved to hear you say that, because there are plenty of skeptics that will try to spin that is the reason. I can't remember who I had. I do believe, I want to say it was Shermer. He was on my show once, Michael Shermer.
Yeah.
And I believe that was part of his narrative, is saying, it's a pop culture influence. And he talked about him thinking he saw, after a long bike ride, thinking he saw, a UFO, but it was something explainable. And as James Fox basically shut him down on a show, like he said, we don't want to talk about the ones was not a UFO, because you could do that all day long. Like I looked up in the sky, I saw, there was a cigar shaped, it's a blimp. We don't need to know any of the stuff that can be explained. It's the very small percentage, but definitely a percentage of the ones that can't be explained. That's where people should be looking. And, and where they come from. I still, I've been doing this show now for, it's almost 13 years now in a couple of months. And I really do not have I don't know if I can ask better questions, but I really don't have any idea. I can't comfortably say that I think they're extraterrestrial. I don't. I can't comfortably say I think they're interdimensional or time travelers. I can't say any of that. And it's just as easy, in my opinion, and it's not me making this up. It's from other people I've heard talk this way. It's more likely something, or part of it is likely to be something we couldn't understand easily or understand at all. So I guess I think
that's common. I think that's a common perspective that I think a lot of thoughtful people, right? People who've spent time really, trying to get the answers. That's a very, very common sort of refrain about it, And I think from my position, because I really am primarily interested in the way in which we human beings sort of try to deal and grapple with that side of things. And, one of the things that creates that's problematic here is certainly the ways in which we have tried to find little boxes to put this thing in, right? The ways we've tried to package them. So, I mean, to me, one of the best examples is just the language we've used historically, right? At first, it was flying saucers. And of course, then by the early 50s, the Air Force is like, oh, God, we hate this language. We hate this. It doesn't work because people aren't just seeing saucer-like things. So they come up with UFO to solve that problem. And of course, very quickly, they learn that doesn't solve the problem, because what happens is the media, what they would do, and often the Air Force would do, is anything that somebody saw in the sky they couldn't explain, they just put it in that bin, the UFO bin. And of course, as you're sort of hinting at, right? That's a lot of stuff. That bin is full of all sorts of different things, many of which are pretty mundane things, right? Pretty ordinary kinds of things. And so when you sort of have this language problem, and now of course we use UAP, and count me in the group that doesn't think this solves the problem. I don't think it solves the language problem, but I know I have colleagues and friends who like it much better. But in any event, it still is something that creates, it opens up questions for us. But what it also does is it means we invariably throw things under that category, and it just clouds up the picture more. So a lot of this has to do with us human beings and the flawed ways in which we go about thinking, right?
I wonder if another intelligence has had this same dilemma, like being visited from wherever they're being visited from, and have the same dilemma of not knowing exactly what they are, and have gone through the similar things that we've gone through, trying to figure out what it is in our skies and in our oceans and whatever, or maybe perhaps around us, and we just don't see them there or know that they're there or something. Who knows? I mean, I just think there's so many mysteries here. Right. And, and there's some people, I'm sure, that you've heard, people think that we're in a simulation. There's all types of theories of and then the brains, the many membranes or whatever they're called, the other alternative lives and things like that. I mean, there's so many questions, and we don't really. I don't think we really understand reality. I don't know.
Right. And I mean, that I like that you laid out all those different kinds of explanations, because that gets at, again, it's been there from the very beginnings of thinking about flying saucers in the late 40s, has been this kind of smorgasbord, if you will, right? Of ideas and theories and speculations. Everybody sort of choosing their own, sometimes the discussion being lively and exciting and productive, as you well know. Sometimes it could get kind of acrimonious and not so nice. But yeah, that's the nature of this whole thing, right? Is that it's really kind of difficult to sort of pin any one thing down. And so at times it feels like there's the flavor of the month, right? That sort of is running things at any given time.
Right. And I think we can in some ways be egocentric, where I mean, we think it's all about us, or like,
Mm.
it's kind of the way religion and is can be handled in a similar type way. Like, we think that every move we make, it's actually something is observing or cares about us in some type of way, and I think that's I think in some ways we can make this whole phenomenon be in that way. And
Mm.
I've asked this particular question to a number of people, like astronomers, and so just want your opinion of it. So say we're the blue marble, we're floating through
Mm.
space, and whoever it is develops how they developed, and they can look at us and detect that we have life, first of all, oxygen, whatever, water, all that. Um, but this could be something that's very common, supposedly very common in the universe. So why would we be getting all the attention? Why why us? Again, it's kind of an egocentric sort of question,
Right.
but
Right.
um, eh, are we that special? I know we have a lot of species, we have a lot of life, but I don't know if that's any different than other, inhabited planets that are out there. I don't know. I mean, are we special?
Right. No, that's a great question. I mean, I see it on two levels too. I mean, the question itself, right? Are we that special? Well, you could point to, Copernicus, of course, pointing out that, hey, guess what? We aren't the center of the solar system or the universe. It's actually the sun. Was one of those moments. Another one was when Darwin puts together, evolution by natural selection, which sort of says, hey, we are one of the animals, so
Yeah.
we're not terribly special. So this would be another version of that, and you're quite right. You'd almost be led to the argument that they either came across us by accident, or we're just the next in line, right? we're
Yeah.
1,370.
Yeah.
It's like you go to the
Hold
deli
the
and you get your
ticket.
ticket.
Yeah.
Here it's our turn, and they aren't
Yeah.
going to stay long because they're moving on to the next place. I mean, what's interesting to me, again, when I think about like the history of how we have tried to grapple with it, what's intriguing is to think about this is that question again was there when people first started to talk about this in the 40s and 50s, and really give it some time about, well, if they're visiting us, why are they visiting us, what's this all about? And of course, you have in the 1950s, you have the famous, some would say infamous, but the famous contactees, right?
Oh, yeah.
Who said they were visited by these really celestial, really wondrous, almost angelic beings. And that was, of course, from their standpoint, it was exactly that. We are special. They've decided to come here to save us from ourselves, to preach a message of love and all of that. And of course, by the time you get to 25, 30 years later, a lot of that stuff is gone. And now you're hearing stories about, little small beings that don't even interact with us, right? Have no interest in us, or just seem to be like collecting plants. Um, so you kind of already had for years, you've had this kind of discussion within the world of people who said they had actual encounters, seemingly reporting very different versions of alien or whatever beings these would be, right? So both sets of arguments could be seen as pointing to certain witnesses over the decades who sort of lead us down different paths, right?
I know you said you were talking earlier about, from the 1975 forward, nobody's really written any book about the history of this. But what about 1940s? I've heard some people speculate, like Stanton Friedman used to say, that because of the nuclear, you know, uh, us getting involved in nuclear weapons, etc. The kids found the matches, that type of thing, and then
Mm-hmm.
that's why some people, not everyone, but some people think that's why all of a sudden the visitation started in 47 and in 52 real heavily, and on and on and on like that. I mean, I'm just asking for a speculation from you as well. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think the modern UFO era was ushered in because of the nuclear situation?
So, Stan Friedman and others make this argument. In fact, it was an argument that got made almost really within the first few years after the Kenneth Arnold sighting, because it was one of the questions that everybody had, right? You had to answer, you had to address a question, which was, um, we haven't heard this thing before. Nobody had heard. Now, of course, there are people now who go backwards and say, oh, we've seen other things that are like this. But certainly at the time, it was seen as really unprecedented. So you had to explain it. You had to say, why now, of all times?
Hmm.
And if the first explanation that made sense to people in the late 40s, you could see why it would make sense. We had just been through a horrendous world war where we had used unprecedented weapons of mass destruction, including 2 atomic bombs that killed hundreds of thousands of people immediately, right? And then you have experimenting and all these atomic tests. So it seemed like a natural explanation for people. And so that argument, I think, as you see with people like Friedman and others, still has legs today. From my standpoint, for me, again, I come back to what interests me is what explanations did people seek out? What made sense to people at any given time about these kinds of things? And it seems to me what you see time and again, particularly in the 40s, 50s, and even the 60s, is everybody kept coming back to the Cold War. Everybody kept saying, or kept finding inspiration, shall we say, in the Cold War. That here it's got to be either our atomic bombs or our atomic weapons, our intercontinental ballistic missiles have caught the attention of these other beings, right? As you said, the kids have found the matches. Or the other argument, of course, which is very common, is these must be secret technologies of one of the superpowers, right? And again, that seemed like a very reasonable explanation. Why? Because, as people said at the time, hey, during World War II, one of the superpowers, the United States, had kept a secret, right? This secret of atomic bombs, and then had used them, and nobody had known about this. So why? It's not that far-fetched to think that the Soviet Union or the Americans are playing loosey-goosey with some new technologies. And we know in some cases that was the case, right? Like the U-2 planes. So you have both of those arguments are going on at the time. And that to me is interesting, is to unpack that and see how people got there.
The one thing that, because I think that too. I think today what people see, I think some of it could be definitely technology. But when you go back far enough in time and you hear people discuss, the maneuvers and things that they had seen way back in the 60s, but also the thing that a lot of people do not talk about very much, I believe, is the fact that these things are seen shooting off at high rates of speed. There's never a sound barrier broken. It's not, whatever it is. I don't, you know, It's possible we may have that technology now, but I don't believe that they had that technology, 40 years ago or longer.
Right.
Any stretch, it just seems like if they had that type of technology, we'd have to know something about it.
Right.
I think if it was
Well,
around
or
that long.
those are the cases, right? Those are always the cases that leaves a lot of people scratching their heads, and
Yeah.
usually they go into the other bin of unexplained phenomena, right? That's the thing you get. I mean, again, it's interesting because I look back, I think about, for instance, back in the 1960s and 70s, when people were really skeptical and downright cynical about the way, say, the U.S. Air Force was dealing with UFO reports and sightings, right? And seemingly so dismissive. And of course, the arguments then, there kind of two camps that you typically saw. The one camp was the people who said, what we would today call disclosure, right? Disclosure movement was the people like Donald Kehoe and NICAP saying, hey, these people know stuff and they're not giving it to us. We need to pressure them. And then there were people like James McDonald or Coral Lorenzen who said, no, you know what? I don't think they do know. I think what it is they're not very good at this stuff. Or to be perfectly blunt, they used to talk more privately how stupid the Air Force was. And they were like, let's quit demanding them give us the information because I don't think they know what the heck is going on. And I don't think they have it.
I agree with that. I say that quite often. I think that I do believe, this is again speculation, but I don't think they have the full picture. I think they may have more of a picture than we do, or some compartmentalized part of our government may have more information than we do. But I still think that it's very possible. The reason we may not see the full disclosure as the big D disclosure, as they say, because I don't think they know the whole picture. And if you don't know the whole picture, then how can you say you can protect someone? You can't say that either if you don't have it all.
Yeah, that would be a very scary option, right, for them.
Yes.
If that was the case. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why the Air Force is holding back. The Navy's more open than the Air Force, but I think they just don't want to have to answer those questions. That's kind of how I feel. Here's another thing. I remember I had Stanton Friedman and Kathy Martin on like a couple of days after there was a Sunday Times, December 16th, I think it was 2017, when the Pentagon, article came out in the New York Times. Well, by happenstance, Stanton Friedman was on that Tuesday afterwards.
Wow.
And that video on YouTube quickly went over 100,000 views. So there was a lot, everyone wanted to know what Stanton Friedman had to say about the whole thing.
Yeah.
And the thing he said right off the bat is, why now? Why are they coming out with this now? So I'm asking you, because you must have addressed 2017 in your book. I haven't looked. I don't know if you did or not, but I mean, what is why would you think that they picked that time? Do you think it was by force in some way because of what was going to be released with videos, or
It's interesting, right? I mean, I've thought long and hard about this, and part of me has come to the conclusion that I need to defer to people, for instance, who have made a career of, say, studying or reporting on the Defense Department, for instance, because I know that's its own very peculiar animal, bureaucratic beast, right? But I've talked about it, and the very thing you're talking that you say Stan Friedman said strikes a chord with me, because I can remember talking with a journalist who was covering and has written about some of this very stuff, and who said to me, I've talked to people who do study the Defense Department, and everybody is, most of the public is always about, hey, what aren't they telling us? What else don't we know? And these things. Who said, no, they always tell us, they always advise us when this stuff happens, is ask yourself, why are they coming out with this? Like, what's the motivation for them to say something when they don't seemingly have to say it? I mean, of course, what it was the New York Times, and then of course Washington Post and Politico were all putting this stuff out there. So there was pressure, but if you remember, there was a lot of hemming and hawing and a lot of delay for a while coming out of there. And then this sort of slow drip of recognition, acknowledgement. And what strikes me is I get the sense that what you saw going on was just a very different political climate than the old days. That there's a lot more voices and a lot more avenues for the public to express its discontent, a lot more platforms for politicians to speak out and to say, hey, this is important to my constituents, or hey, you know, I've made a career out of looking after the welfare of people of people in the Air Force and the Navy because I got a base right here in my own district, right? That seems to me to be a different climate than, say, existed back in the 1950s and 60s during the Cold War, when I think there was greater kind of censorship and self-censorship going on. But that's the best I can come up with. To me, it still remains, and I know a lot of other people scratch their heads and say, what is it about 2017 and 18 that allowed this kind of genie to get out of the bottle, right?
Right. Yeah. And you know, you could say also the same thing. Like, is this a place where if you know, the old term, follow the money, you know, I mean, that's what, you know, Congress has been trying to figure out, because, you know, there's some, and I don't know where that stands these days. We just came up on the year. I was actually in the room in DC when that hearing happened.
Oh,
and
wow.
I was lucky enough to be the second to last person in there. Now we're a year out, and you know, I mean, it doesn't feel like I don't know really what happened. You know, I mean, was there momentum? I mean, does it feel? It feels like there was momentum. But you know, when you're looking at this topic for a while, there's plenty of stages where you feel like there's forward movement, and then you get discouraged again. And you know, Lou Elizondo's book got leaked, and it's out there everywhere. And I've been trying to help him or retain some of the copies to, you know, get them taken off. But he's coming up in September, you know, on my show here. So I'm going to be asking him a lot of, you know, these questions. And one of them comes up all the time. Someone just sent me something. They took my quotes and some news story or whatever about the 23-minute video. Have you heard about that?
I have heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't wait to talk to him about, I mean, I talk with basically, you know, his wife through email. That's how I communicate with him. But I'm really curious about that video.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like that's supposed to be another moving,
but
move the needle situation.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, to go back to just what you were saying about this and how you contextualized it. I mean, again, this has been, and anybody who's been in the business of UFO study, when I talk to the veterans, they're all very, very familiar with this stuff. Is that this is exactly the pattern that you've seen since the 40s, is these patterns, these moments when there is this, like I say, concentration of a lot of energy, people get mobilized, there's leading voices who are leading the charge and who are having an impact on public perceptions and seemingly getting movement on behalf within the government circles, even sometimes impacts on civilian research and academia. And then it just sort of falls away. It just all sort of disappears and dissipates. And how people try to keep that alive is typically with some sort of new development, right? I mean, you can go back and look over old cases only so many times before you need more cases to sort of talk about and look at. So that's the MO of, I think, the way this has always played out. The reality is, it just seems to me every single time, just about every single time, people get disappointed with the way the intelligence community comes back at this. I don't think I've ever seen a time when when large groups of people who were interested in UFOs have been satisfied with that. You know, for my money, if you really are interested in seeing some sort of movement, it's going to have to be on the civilian side of things, which means, I always tell people, to me, the most encouraging thing is to see NASA get behind this. NASA is about civilian academics getting involved. And of course, when NASA says, hey, it's okay to study this stuff, we academics say, all right, if you start saying there's money available, we trust me, we'll write the grants, we'll do the research. So that's good. That's starting to go on. And so I think if you want to hang your hat on something, that to me is the real sea change that you say that's pretty unprecedented. We never had something like that happen before. In the over 75 years of history that we've seen. That to me is where maybe, just maybe, you'll see developments and you'll see research that we've never, ever had a chance to see before.
I know what you're saying about NASA, and I was all excited too. But whenever they came out with the $100,000 budget, I just thought that was, that's like buying a lunch for them. It just seemed like, what do I want to say? Window dressing. It didn't seem like, it didn't seem legit to me, but I don't know.
No,
I don't know. Has it gone further?
No, well, here's the thing. I mean, I said the same thing when it first came out. I mean, $100,000 for an agency like that is you can't even buy out a full professor for that amount of money. So, but what was made very clear was this wasn't to a study, a concerted study of UFOs. What it was simply, as the the director or the chair pointed out about it, this was supposed to be establishing a roadmap for future research. The idea was, hey, well, before we can even do investigations, we need to have set ideas about what are the guidelines, what are the kinds of tools and resources we're going to need if in fact we want to ever study this stuff in a seriously scientific way. And that's all they tried to do. And that, I will say, they delivered that. They delivered that. And now the idea is supposedly, now go out and let's start doing this stuff. Now, from my point of view, this is where people in academia say, show me the money. All right, let's see the money. And you're right. If we don't see NASA or the National Science Foundation putting up some funds for people to do this stuff, then maybe you get skeptical and you say, okay, this was a lot of talk, but no real foundation behind it.
I'm thank you for clarifying that, because I was unaware of that, and I don't think they made it very obvious that that's what they were doing, or I just didn't read enough about it. So all I saw was that amount of money for funding, and I just thought, well, that doesn't really mean anything then. But thanks for looking into it more.
And I think they again, I know people were in various circles were very critical of what they said and how they approached it. I think if you read it, you read their report, but you listen to what was said in the public news conference. This was stuff that is completely unprecedented for NASA. The history of NASA has been to put UFOs at arm's length.
Yes,
they did not want to touch it when Wernher von Braun was around. Never wanted to get near it. This is a very different climate and a very different way of talking about this stuff. And the fact that there too, recognition and acknowledgement that what people were talking about and what particularly pilots were reporting on seeing were actual objects, were actual objects and not just computer glitches. That is something that is really, like I say, quite unusual for an agency like NASA. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't know what to think about, since we're on the topic of NASA. I don't really know what to think about some of the footage, it seems to me, like when you see UFOs from the space station or something like that, or outside of the shuttles in some of the old films. And a lot of times they say, well, this is ice particles. This is, something like, I think a stage that dropped off, that looks, very weird from far away. I had a conversation with Alan Bean, fourth person on the moon, several years ago, and I couldn't get, supposedly in 1970, I can't remember, Space Lab. I can't remember the name of whatever it was, but there was a long Skylab. Yeah, there was some type of thing with a tail, red tail on, that they all spotted. I could not. He was on my other. I do a podcast on art and antiques, and he was an amazing artist. So he talked about his art, but when I try to get him to talk about that UFO, talk about it. But there are people that will. I had Story Musgrave, for instance. He was on my show years ago, and he talked about UFOs. And I know there are other people that Gordon. What am I thinking of? Gordon, the famous astronaut.
I know who
you know who I mean. Yeah. I can't think of his full name right now. But anyway, and shame on me for that. He was a great guy. But there are people that took this subject serious for many decades, and have a lot of validity. But there are people that talked about they saw something in the moon. I don't know whether I believe that stuff. I don't know. Like they think there's beings on the moon and all that. I don't know. Again, it seems egocentric. Why would they be here, at arm's length and studying us? And
right.
I don't know what to think about any of
that. Right. Exactly. We probably, if that were the case, you'd think they get pretty bored of us after a while. It'd be like watching one long game of golf or something, because we human beings keep seeming to make the same mistakes over and over again, don't we?
Oh yeah. Yeah. The Truman Show. Yeah. But I mean, how is there any place in your book for the purported abductions that people claim to have? Did that
I do.
Make your book?
I do. I do talk about that in the book, and particularly the last substantive chapter is about alien abduction and trying to understand it in the context of its time. And there again, my argument is not to dismiss it. And I make this point very clearly in the book. My book is not designed to support the idea that aliens are visiting us. Neither is it an effort at debunking. I'm doing what historians have done for a very long time, which is to sit back and to say, hey, how can we understand the way in which people sort of reacted and responded to certain realities, right? How did they do that? How did they try to put the pieces together? And then how did then people respond to the way people put those pieces together? And so that's what I do with alien abduction is I take it seriously, but the idea is to understand, how did this thing come to be when you understand it in the stream of UFO history? And what you see is, what's striking to me is the way in which so many of the ways in which people talked about it were built on certain kinds of reference points that existed at the time, right? So that people helped sort of built ways to understand what they were experiencing by turning to, what a historian once called the mental tools available to them at the time, right? So people saw, described operations that sounded like a laparoscopy, talked about forms of what appeared to be technologies of cloning at a time when, of course, cloning was very, very big, right? Things like this that were ways in which, like I say, don't denigrate the way people talked about their experience, but says that, people had to find ways to make sense of something that was for them utterly bewildering. And then the other thing I talk about is the critical role played by what I call consoling consultants. People like David Jacobs, people like Bud Hopkins, people like John Mack.
John Mack. I was going to ask about John Mack.
The very important, the very important role they played. They do not play an inconsequential role, because all of them came to the phenomenon with certain ideas in their heads and saw in the phenomenon something that made sense to them. Right? They themselves didn't have those same experiences, though I know Hopkins had a UFO experience, but I don't believe he ever had an abduction experience himself. But the idea is that they play a really important mediating role in helping to steer people they were talking with to view things in certain kinds of ways. Again, not an unusual phenomenon, but it is sort of interesting that when you see people who would go to Leo Sprinkle or John Mack tended to view their experience one way. If you went to David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins, you tended to view it another way, right? Not an accident, given who those people were, and of course their very different attitudes about what this phenomenon was all about, right? So that's the kind of stuff I want to try to understand and unpack, and how those role of mediators help to shape very different perspectives on the phenomenon.
So do you think that people like John Mack and Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, they all come to the table with preconceived notions before they even started? Is that kind of your thought?
I think the way I would put it is before somebody has walked in the door or writes them in a letter, right? They had some ideas in their mind that were very fixed, some of them not very fixed, right? But they had something to call on. Let's face it, otherwise you couldn't exactly be a very good counselor or consultant to somebody, right? If you had no preconceptions, then I don't know why I would come to you, right? They had identities, and people knew this. And you talk to people who said, I deliberately sought out so-and-so because I knew about their reputation. So they had some very clear ideas about what they were doing. It doesn't mean that they implanted or created these experiences for people. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is that just as if you were to go for advice from a counselor, right, which most of us have done in our lives, even if it's like a vocational counselor, they have something in their minds about how they're going to talk with us. And that's going to help shape the way I'm going to start to think about what was going on. That, to me, is a really interesting social relationship. And it's a social relationship that is complex and that I think requires thinking about very seriously, which of course people did at the time.
Now I'm going to just throw this at you live. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind going like another 15 minutes further. I just feel like I feel like I could talk to you for another few hours, but if I could have 15 more minutes or so,
sure,
time,
that's fine.
Yeah. So I just want to say to that, I want to say goodbye to everyone over at KGRA Radio, and we'll be back. I'll be down on the Cape Cod next week, and face to face with Robert Schroeder, who has a nuts and bolts type of theory of how some UFOs have propulsion. He's a great guy. I had him on years ago. Robert Schroeder, and he's an engineer. It'll be a great show next week. So thank you, everyone at KGRA Radio, and we'll see you next week. I think this is also fascinating, and I want to ask you how you thought. Well, I'll just tell you my opinion first, and I want to understand yours a little, what you thought about it. I thought John Mack was an incredible person, first of all. And ironically, I did work at selling a house full of beautiful antiques for someone in Wellesley, Massachusetts, that was a friend of his, and was distraught when Harvard was trying to push him out and all that, and saw all the turmoil he went through. But what I wanted to basically say is when you watch John Mack with those kids at the Ariel school, he was just wonderful. He was down to their level. He was not feeding them any information. Talked to some of these, children that are adults now, and basically said he's the only one they really wanted to talk to. These other people were nice and everything, but they felt really comfortable around him.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking you is, do you think if John Mack was around today, that things would be different for him? He wouldn't have to go through all the turmoil that he did at the time. And, I don't even know the full John Mack story, even though I've had some people on that one woman, Diane, I can't remember her name, was going to make a film about him. But anyway, I don't really know what the genesis of how he started in particular. I don't really know.
I talk about it in the book. So it's not a surprise that at all to me to hear what you say about him and the way he talked with these children and others. I mean, he was an enormously well-respected psychiatrist. I mean, he was absolutely beloved by his colleagues, right? Who really respected him, and so he was seen as a very talented person. I mean, this is his training, but it was also his personality. But he was somebody who always had a very much of a broad perspective on what his mission was in the world as a psychiatrist and a researcher. And he was, well before he got into UFOs and abduction, he was very interested in two things. One is changing the world. He became a climate activist. He was very interested in the peace movement. He was very, very much someone who saw himself as somebody who was going to take an active role in helping make the world a better place. The other thing that he gets into before he gets into the alien abduction phenomenon is something called transpersonal psychology, right? Which is this psychology that understands the human personality more broadly as connected to the wider cosmos. A kind of I guess a lot of people would think of it as something kind of new age-like, right? New agey kind of thing. And so he had already had this idea that part of making the world a better place also means improving yourself and connecting to really the universe and seeing yourself as part of really a kind of cosmic citizenship. And so when he meets Bud Hopkins and hears about these people who are abductees, he said, I was absolutely skeptical. And then I talked to them, and they don't strike me as mentally ill. They don't strike me as hallucinating. They strike me as very lucid, thoughtful people. And I'm starting to think that what this is something much bigger than I had ever imagined. And so he saw it as fitting into this bigger picture. And, he himself, he did say, I think that most of these people are actually having real experiences about a reality. He himself kind of hedged his bets. He sometimes said, I think they're extraterrestrials. And then at other times, he really doesn't. He backs away from that. But he did think that these folks were having very real experiences that were worthy and transformative, but also worthy of study, and that they needed help. They needed help in grappling with something so big that it sort of defied explanation for themselves. And so that's how he was open to this prospect in that way.
I see. I'm going to go back and talk about egocentric one more time. Because, having a conversation with someone off record, not on this show, but someone who, mentions that they were abducted. And I do believe something seriously, did happen. It's not just, it's someone that I know that's very, very stable and talked about it. But that same person thinks that whatever it is that is abducting people is going to intervene, if we do go to war. And I think that's seems, again, like I used this like 5 times today, egocentrical. It's kind of like he in particular is saying this because he says that we're all connected, and he believes that whatever it is may be here with us and has been with us, and it's a higher intelligence here,
Mm, mm,
and they have a lot at stake, and that's why they're going to intervene if
mm,
we can't make it through the bottleneck and we start to blow ourselves up. He's totally convinced that they're going to intervene. I
mm,
don't know what to think about that, but he says it's not just us; it's all the species all the
mm,
living species,
mm,
and
mm.
of course would all be affected if we blow ourselves up, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
right. I see it. You're right, and the term is belief because one doesn't have much else to go on when it comes
right.
to something like that. But again, I will say the one thing that happens with most historians, most of my colleagues and friends who are historians, is unfortunately when you study history, you actually tend to become a pessimist about life.
Yeah, sure.
The story of history can be very, very depressing about
Well,
what
what is
human beings and the way the world has worked. That
yeah,
said,
what is that? Oh, I'm sorry.
no, I'm
Yeah,
sorry, but I also try to, as much as possible, whether I'm teaching or whether I'm writing, I do try to identify either great moments where things did in fact change, or people who have made huge differences for the better. You can find lots and lots of examples of that. We have in fact faced down major crises and walked back from real peril in the past, even if it seems at times that things are hopeless. So as much as I must admit I have a tendency to get a little pessimistic at times, I do hang on to a thread of optimism that I'm not willing to relinquish, and the
yeah.
belief that there's always a way out. There's always avenues to get out of these thorny situations, and somehow we have managed at times to do just that.
There's the saying I don't know who said it, but it's a wiser yet sadder man I am. I don't know if you ever heard
Yeah,
that one, but
I
yeah,
had no. I like that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But I mean, I'm optimistic too. I think, but I think unfortunately, I think we're at the point where it really takes something major because, like if someone said, "Hey, look, if we give up our cell phones, everyone in the world gives up their cell phones, then we can solve climate change." I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I'd have
no,
to really think about it,
no.
and it would be
No.
like, okay, well, how do I know everyone's going to give it up?
Exactly.
If it was something like that, if there was some type of that, we once we get our technology, it's really hard for us to let go. And you think of everything that
Yeah,
powers the earth, everything that we're, except for renewable energy, we're taking the sunlight from, millions of years and basically going through that energy. And, we're using that energy and not really
yeah.
replacing it much, so yeah, I mean, I don't know what type of road, we're on,
No,
I don't
we
want to get
are
depressing either.
no.
It's easy to do.
Easy to do at
Yeah.
times.
Yeah. Here's a question that came in, and please, thank you for putting it in caps, and people, please do. If you want to ask a question, does Greg see anything different about the current public discussion? Oh, progress us more towards transparency than in prior times. Thank you for the question, Eve.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that folds in really nicely with what Martin, you and I were talking about when we talked about NASA. It's just maybe the way I think is that trying to get transparency out of governments is historically been difficult, particularly in the modern world. It's just the nature of the beast. And I don't know that anytime soon government is ever going to change on that count. I think where you get transparency is through people getting access to information that they themselves are able to glean. And so I put a lot of hope in what seems to me something that is very unusual, which is a lot more, as I say, academics getting into and studying this stuff. And I know at times people can be very cynical about us academics and thinking that we're part of the problem. But, the thing is still to this day, we are an environment in which we work, and you're supposed to work transparently. You get to see all my data. My book has lots of footnotes, so you know where exactly I'm getting my information. Our data is there for other people to look at and to criticize. We go through peer review where other people criticize our stuff and go to conferences. We don't keep anything from you. And in fact, if we're keeping something from you, somebody else is going to find it and then come back to you and say, then why didn't you bring this up? We're a good place for people going about stuff in a really serious, thoughtful way that says, by the way, we don't have to play by the rules of the intelligence community, right? Because we don't have to keep secrets. We don't keep secrets. That to me is where the future of transparency lies. And I will say there is a lot of action going on. I think a lot of people are not aware of this, but there's a lot going on in academia right now. In fact, in a few weeks, I'm going to be I'm helping to organize this conference of the Society for UAP Studies that's meeting online. Feel free to come join us and listen in on some of the great talks we're going to have. But it's a society that is all about just that: scholarly, open, transparent research and trying to find answers to the phenomenon on all sorts of levels. That to me is the future. And I think that is encouraging.
Yeah, so a lot of people are still talking about the, I think it was called Soul.
Yeah.
Gary
Gary
Nolan
Nolan.
out in California organized that. And I wrote to him, I really want to make sure I get there next year if that's going to happen again. SCU you're talking about, they had a conference already, like a live conference, right?
That's SCU, and this is a different
Oh, this is
organization.
different. What is the organization?
This is the Society for UAP Studies. It's been around now. We've been around for what, about a year and a half. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yep.
it is different than all the other organizations in that it really its focus is really exclusively built around scientific academic research. And it's all about promoting that and finding avenues for that to get explored and to get discussed. So it's not about lobbying. It's not about white papers. It's not about policy making. It's really a scholarly organization. And that's what makes it different. That's what makes it different from, I think, a lot of other organizations.
To me that I had, like, I'm just looking right now, but I don't see it. At one time, I did have like a graphic on my website that would lead people to that. So I'm going to ask you, once we get done our show tonight, if you wouldn't mind sending me, information about that so I can. Yeah. And this person just asked, are you accepting volunteers to help the cause? I mean, that wouldn't be you. You're involved, but you're not like an organizer. Are you in any type of way?
I'm an organizer. I'm an organizer of the conference. I serve on the advisory board. But I'm sure there are different sort of departments, or departments is the wrong term, but different aspects of the organization. But one of the organizations, if you are not an academic researcher, but you're looking to help get involved, we have a group who work in citizen science. And we actually have a whole section of the organization that reports on citizen science work, because we think citizen science is one of those things that's really, really important in building. You can't just leave this to us academics. We need to have people from all walks of life involved. And so I think you can find that. So what I'll do is when I'll give you the information, Martin, and you can distribute this information about the conference. When you go to the conference site, you'll see information about the organization and what it's about and how to get involved. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I have several years that I have seen, so many people in academics and science, finally, to me, it's one of the most incredible questions, puzzles that could be answered, but I've seen, and I have to say that it goes back to the 2017 article coming out of the New York Times that's when I saw the shift where
Yeah.
people, I started, because I used to say, I had a few different people on, scientists, and over the years, where I'd say, why does science not take this topic seriously and look into it? And I've had answers ranged from, there's no funding, we couldn't get funding, and the reason we couldn't get funding is that there's an end game.
Mm.
You can't really see closure on this because, for instance, you see a UFO, it's a fleeting thing.
Right.
It's not something that, hotspots can be, the place where things can be observed a lot.
Right.
But still, for the average Joe out there seeing a UFO, it's maybe a once in a lifetime. Like,
Yeah.
I consider myself that. I've seen
Yeah.
other things, but I don't know if they're unexplained.
Yeah.
The first thing I saw, I still want to say, will always be unexplained to me. But here's another question here. Let's see. What are your thoughts on the upcoming public hearing? Is there one confirmed for this fall?
Oh yeah, is there one? Terrence might know something we don't know.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I'd like to know more.
I hadn't heard about this.
Maybe that just slipped. I never saw it, and I would like to be there again because that was really exciting.
Yeah.
To meet with like-minded people, and 1,000 people showed up for those 30 seats.
Yeah. Wow.
Which is
I'll
quite
bet.
amazing. They never saw anything. The people that worked there in that building, I forget the name of the building, but the people that work there, they said they have never seen anything like it.
I'll bet.
As far as people showing up. So, but anyway, your book, it is linked down below in the text, and it's right behind you after the flying saucers.
My shoulder here. Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
There it is.
Yeah. There it is right there. So yeah, make
is.
sure you look at that book, and there's a free preview right on our website on that.
Good.
Not the whole book, of course, but that just comes up naturally.
Good.
But thank you, Greg. It's been a real pleasure as always, and I really love having this conversation with you. It's great, and I like the fact that you look at this with a real balanced thoughts, but you're not denigrating in any type of way, or saying, oh yeah, the abductees, or whatever.
No.
There's
that would be irresponsible. That would be irresponsible.
Yes. Yeah. And I like that. But thank you very much, Greg.
Thanks, Martin. This was great as usual.
Yeah, thank you. Hope to talk to you soon. All right, everyone. We'll be back next week again with Robert Schroeder. I'm going to be down at the Cape, and we're going to be face to face. And it should be another really great show. Thank you so much for watching and being here every week. And remember to keep your eyes in the sky.